You know, when you requested this deep dive on the oil industry, I gotta say I was hooked from the get-go. You've got this, like, perfect storm brewing, right? A
Yeah.
pandemic turning everything upside down, power plays on the world stage, and an industry that's wrestling with its own future.
Mhm.
And one thing that really struck me in what you sent over was this comparison to King Pyrrhus.
Oh, it's a really fascinating parallel, isn't it? King Pyrrhus, the ancient Greek general, winning these battles, but at such a huge cost that they were basically defeats in disguise, captures the idea of a Pyrrhic victory perfectly, makes you wonder if the oil industry is headed down a similar path.
That's the million-dollar question we're digging into today, isn't it? Is the oil industry fighting a losing battle on multiple fronts? To really understand that, we've got to rewind a bit, look back at the pre-pandemic years. The stuff you sent, it paints this picture of an industry already on shaky ground even before COVID hit the scene. This whole shale oil boom and bust cycle, for example. What a roller coaster that was.
Right. It was a time of massive growth, fueled by these technological leaps in hydraulic fracking as we know it. Suddenly, these huge oil reserves that were untouchable before became accessible, leading to this surge in production, especially in the U.S. Money was pouring in, but this boom, well, it also ended up creating a glut, which ultimately pushed prices down.
And that's where OPEC steps onto the playing field, right? They saw this wave of American shale oil as a direct threat, and they weren't about to just roll over and give up their market share.
Exactly. OPEC, with big players like Saudi Arabia and Russia, they responded by cranking up their own production, their goal, to maintain their grip on the market. They were willing to weather lower prices for a while if it meant squeezing out the competition, especially those higher-cost shale producers in the States.
So it's like this high-stakes game of chicken, but on a global scale.
Right. And it's crucial to remember the geopolitical forces at play here, too. For countries like Saudi Arabia, Russia, oil revenue isn't just about profits, it's about power. It's intertwined with their political influence on the world stage, their ability to keep things stable back home.
It's like a giant chess game, every move calculated to achieve those big picture objectives. But then, right in the middle of all of this, the world gets hit with, well, a black swan event, the COVID-19 pandemic.
And it exposed just how fragile the oil industry, how fragile the entire global economy could be.
Those early pandemic days, man, those images were surreal. Cruise ships turned into floating oil storage tanks because nobody was traveling, storage facilities overflowing left and right. And then you had this almost unbelievable thing where the price of oil, get this, it goes negative. Negative.
Yeah, those negative prices, as shocking as they were a direct result of demand falling off a cliff. Lockdowns, travel bans, all of that caused oil consumption to plummet, and suddenly you've got this massive oversupply on your hands.
And because oil is a physical thing, it has to be stored somewhere, this whole situation created logistical nightmares. You couldn't just turn off the taps. Producers were literally running out of places to stash the oil they were pumping.
And this is where West Texas Intermediate WTI going negative comes in. It's a benchmark for U.S. oil prices. And when it dipped into the negative, it meant traders were actually willing to pay to get rid of their oil contracts. They had nowhere to put it.
Talk about a clear sign that the pandemic had thrown the entire industry into chaos, huh?
It really puts things into perspective, doesn't it? The whole idea of producers paying to get rid of oil was just unheard of a short while ago.
Shows you how even these massive, well-established industries can get completely flipped on their heads by events no one saw coming. And the fallout, it wasn't just contained to the oil industry either. This report, it really digs into the domino effect it had on the global economy.
Oh, absolutely. The oil industry is like this web connected to everything: transportation, manufacturing, finance, even the stuff you buy at the store. When oil prices tank, those shockwaves, they're felt everywhere.
And we saw it happen in front of our eyes. Jobs, especially in those oil-producing areas, gone. Investments drying up left and right. And the companies, many already drowning in debt from the shale boom, well, they were suddenly in a really tough spot.
And that's where the whole U.S. junk bond market thing comes into play. You see, the energy sector, they're known for these boom and bust cycles, right? Often loaded up on debt. So they started issuing a ton of junk bonds. And those bonds, well, they're considered risky business. When the oil market crashed, those bonds went right down with it, which created a whole new set of problems.
So it's like this chain reaction, one thing going wrong, impacting everything else. And in the middle of this whole chaotic situation, you've got governments all over the world scrambling, trying to figure out how to stabilize things. This material you sent, it really breaks down some of the actions they took.
Yeah, so OPEC, facing this crazy situation, they take this huge historic step, agreeing to slash production. They're thinking, cut the supply way back to try and rebalance things with the drop in demand.
But even getting everyone on the same page for that agreement, that couldn't have been easy, could it? You've got all these different countries, each with their own agendas, sometimes with conflicting interests, and let's just say a history of differing opinions on how to manage the global oil market.
Exactly. To get everyone to agree on those production cuts, and those were huge cuts, it took a lot of back and forth, a lot of compromises. And even with those cuts in place, it was still up in the air whether it would be enough to really offset the huge drop in demand.
And that's where you run into the limitations of just cutting back on production, right? It's not like turning a faucet on and off.
Right. It's a lot more complicated than that. Oil production, it's this whole process involves long-term planning, investment, infrastructure, and you can't just mess with that overnight. And if you just shut down production completely, well, you risk damaging the oil fields, making it even harder to get things up and running again later.
You're basically stuck between a rock and a hard place, right?
Yeah.
Cut production too much, you risk screwing things up in the long run. But if you don't cut enough, you're still drowning in excess oil, prices stay low. There's no winning there. And then there's the whole question of government intervention, right? That was a big deal.
Especially in the U.S., where the shale boom had created this whole new part of the oil industry. There was a lot of pressure on the government to step in and do something, whether it was bailouts, tax breaks, you name it.
It's a hot potato no politician wants to touch, isn't it?
Yeah.
Trying to find that balance between helping an industry that's struggling and avoiding those unintended consequences, like propping up companies that might not survive in the long run.
And it all comes back to that King Pyrrhus comparison, where the actions they took, while maybe necessary at the time, were they setting the stage for a win that actually weakens the whole industry in the long term, a Pyrrhic victory?
That's the million-dollar question, and it takes us to the core of our deep dive. What does all this mean for you listening right now? What's your stake in this global energy roller coaster? You might be sitting there thinking, okay, this is all interesting and everything, but how does it actually affect me? And that's a great question. It's easy to feel disconnected from these global issues, but the truth is this isn't just some abstract economic theory. This affects you directly.
It really does. Every time you fill up your tank, pay your bills, even when you're at the grocery store, those prices, they're influenced by what's happening in the oil industry.
Exactly. The price of oil, it's like this ripple effect. It goes out and touches every corner of the economy. And when it's high, you get inflation. Transportation costs go up, and suddenly everything at the store costs more.
Right. And oil is such a crucial ingredient for so many industries. These price swings, they can really mess things up. Supply chains get disrupted, and it can even slow down the entire global economy.
It's all connected, and it really highlights how much we depend on this one energy source, even with everyone talking about renewable energy and all that. And speaking of renewables, this whole crisis, it kind of shined a spotlight on just how vulnerable our reliance on fossil fuels makes us, didn't it?
Absolutely. The pandemic, it forced everyone to change their energy consumption habits almost overnight. Demand just fell off a cliff. And it showed everyone just how volatile a system can be when it's so heavily reliant on just one source.
It was a wake-up call for sure. It made a lot of people ask, is this it for oil? Are we witnessing the beginning of the end?
Yeah, it's a question worth asking. This whole thing could be what pushes us to transition to cleaner, more sustainable energy sources. But of course, it's not that simple. The analysis you sent, it pointed out how complex that kind of shift would be. It could create its own set of challenges.
It would be a huge undertaking. We're talking massive investments in new infrastructure, technology, and people would have to change their habits too, not to mention the geopolitical implications. It could completely redraw the map in terms of power dynamics, both economically and politically.
Exactly.
Yeah.
We're talking about stepping into uncharted territory. There are a lot of challenges, but also a lot of opportunities.
Absolutely. And it all begs the question, what will the future hold? Will it be a world powered by renewables, or will we cling to the familiar, even if those sources are unsustainable in the long run?
The million-dollar question. And it's one that deserves our attention. As we've seen, the choices we make today, they have a ripple effect. It's not just about the global energy market. It's about the environment, geopolitics, our everyday lives. Everything is connected.
Well said. As we wrap up this deep dive, we want to leave you with this one last thought-provoking idea to chew on. The future of energy isn't just about barrels of oil and prices going up and down. It's way more complex than that. It's about economics, politics, the environment, and our ability to innovate and find solutions. So stay curious, stay informed, and be part of shaping the future of energy. That's it for today's deep dive. Until next time, keep exploring, keep those brains engaged, and we'll see you on the next one.